That's a great segue to our initial conversation amongst ourselves. And Sergio and Andres, how would you respond to that skepticism, those skeptical points that Gordon had about the context and moving beyond the politics to actually get a rule enforced, get a rule in place, and get it implemented at the same time? In Chile, how did you do it? And Sergio, how would we do it in Puerto Rico?
I think that's a great question. I mean, naturally, coming out of a big debt crisis, anybody who spends 5 minutes thinking about it is going to be skeptical. But I want to argue that politically these things work not because they get rid of politics. You know, politics, they simply change the way the political debate about spending is conducted. And I can make it very, very practical and explicit for you. If you have no spending ceiling because you have no rule, if you're the finance minister, you negotiate with every spending agency in the government, and the budget is whatever it is. You know, you add it all up, and you know, it could be 10, it could be 20, it could be 50. And of course, spending agencies and spending ministries or whatever know that, and they behave in a way that anticipates that the budget is whatever the residual is. Once you have a rule, and once the rule has been kind of made part of the national psyche, and Sergio said something important, the rule is going to be really simple, because that way every taxi driver knows about the rule, right? If it's complicated, you know, a bunch of budget nerds like us, you know, will know about it, right? But if it's really simple, and if there's one credible number that you publish once a year, you know, you can get in a cab and talk about it. So once that has happened, you're the politician trying to design the budget. You sit down with the guys who want to spend, and you say, look, I feel for you. You know, I really want to do that project that will cost another $2 billion. And, you know, if it were within my power, I would do it. But we're against the ceiling, you know. And if you really want to do it, fine. But bring me an item we can get rid of. And it changes the dynamic. Politics is still there, but you argue about shares of a given pie as opposed to arguing about a pie of unlimited size. And that really makes the politics very, very different. One other thought, and the three of you mentioned it in some way or another. For this thing to be credible, it has to be an answer to what is the big problem in Puerto Rico today, which is the economy is tanking. So if a bunch of people come and say, look, I realize the unemployment rate is whatever it is, you know, 20%, you know, the economy is not growing, poverty is rising, and I'm going to force a big fiscal contraction on you off the bat, believe me, that wouldn't fly anywhere, right? So you need a rule that does two things at once. And of course, this is the same debate they're having in Europe. You need a rule that is flexible enough so that you get a little leeway up front, so you can do a bit of fiscal stimulus. You're going to need it. Purely on humanitarian grounds, you're going to need it. But which is credible down the road and says, we're going to do a little fiscal stimulus now, and then down the road, you know, credibly debt is going to go down. Last point that I want to make is this. If you do that, the rule becomes credible because people begin to understand its benefits. You know, when we applied the rule in Chile, it was done by a left-wing government. And the very same constituency of the left-wing government, in the beginning, it was up in arms. They hated this, right? But what happened? There were two events that made it palatable even for the very far left. Event number one is that, you know, when they first applied in the first year, they did a calculation, you know, they put all the numbers into the blender, pressed the button, and out came a magical number. That year, it allowed for a deficit. So suddenly, the more liberal politicians said, I love this. You know, I have a rule and it allows for a small deficit. This is wonderful. So that gave it some buy-in for the left. Then, a decade later, you know, the world collapsed. Wall Street went to hell. And suddenly, the rule allowed us to spend more and run a deficit. And, you know, we also had a lot of money in hand so that we could run a deficit without going to the bond markets. And suddenly, the population said, wow, this is great. You know, we now understand. You know, you were saving all that money, and when you were saving it, it was very controversial. You know, I took the brunt of it. And now we know that the money can be used. And as a result, today, you know, 15 years later, the fiscal rule is a non-issue politically. People quarrel about the details, exactly the definition of a variable, but you will not find a single politician in the country that is really against the rule, because it was made politically palatable. And I think that's not too much to hope if we take that idea to Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm.
I think on a more technical level, we are going to need a lot of help to implement this rule in terms of the technical details as to how to design the rule. And I think that's where there's a potential role for any fiscal oversight mechanism from the federal government, giving us the resources or access to resources they may have at places like the CBO, or helping us open doors at places like the National Bureau of Economic Research that may have, the needed expertise, and most importantly, transfer some of that knowledge and expertise to Puerto Rican institutions, so we can actually keep that knowledge in Puerto Rico and use it going forward. Secondly, in terms of the local mechanics in Puerto Rico, we're going to have to do a lot of legislation. We have here the President of the Senate, it would be great if he could, in his closing remarks, mention, a little bit about how this could be done in terms of the legislative mechanics in Puerto Rico. How do we sell this locally in the island from a political side? I do think, though, that the idea of having a very clear goal, simple number that can be monitored by, as Andres said, from anybody from an analyst sitting in Wall Street to a taxi driver in San Juan, it's a very good one, because that would hold politicians accountable. You're not meeting your stated budget, and eventually it's gonna get buy-in. And finally, the idea that within the cap, you could still have the traditional political give and take that it's normally in the democracy, as to which programs get funded and which not. It's also very helpful. So this is not taking away the authority from the Puerto Rico legislature to actually allocate money. We're just saying this is the cap, and within that cap, you guys can negotiate all you want, but this is the number, and you cannot go above it. So. It's very important to make that clear to the people of Puerto Rico. That's the way it's going to work.
So there seems to be somewhat of a tacit consensus that some sort of oversight is needed amongst all of you, based on your remarks. And this is sort of one of the driving questions of this panel, right? I do wonder to what extent Congressman Bishop, for example, has raised the issue that he wants an oversight board that respects autonomy, quote unquote. Respecting autonomy, what does that mean? And this is a question for all of you. What does respecting autonomy mean in the context of an oversight board, and with the technical dimension that this kind of rule and implementing it requires?
I'll just jump out. First is that I think we all understand that when people say things like, well, it's got to respect this and it's got to respect that, it's saying, well, I understand it's politically difficult and we'll figure it out later. I don't imagine that we've quite seen the respect of autonomy in any legislative language as yet. And more to the point is, invariably, in the context in which we're having this discussion, there will be people who will find any imposition of I think a board or anything imposed under I guess the current situation as being an imposition on sovereignty and on sort of on the Commonwealth. And so I don't imagine that there's any scenario going forward where people aren't going to feel that there's some degree of imposition. And folks are just going to have to figure out what that degree is. I mean, there's obviously the DC Control Board has been one that many people have liked to point to. I think Mayor Williams was fairly eloquent in how he described the sentiment here, including his own prior to its implementation. There's some evidence that, according to him, it worked. But obviously, Puerto Rico's not analogous entirely to DC, and so how a fiscal control board, to the extent one is imposed, would apply to the Commonwealth, I think, remains to be seen, and people will have to actually write down what that acknowledgement of the Commonwealth's rights actually look like.
So one thing about the DC analogy is the DC government had a very different relationship to the federal government. And one thing that I left off of my table of sort of powers or responsibilities that a financial control board or an emergency manager or external overseer can have is expenditure reassignment or tax reassignment. One thing that the DC Control Board did and the federal government did was to take some aspect of the pension burden off of the DC government, some expenditure responsibilities like the courts off of the DC government. So there was an infusion of resources that also made it, to the extent that it was politically acceptable and it was actually controversial at the time, that sweetener really helped out. And I think that was the case in the Eurozone countries as well. And so that's an open question. The Treasury's plan involved not just financial oversight and restructuring, but also Medicaid parity and an expansion of the EITC. Those other pieces could be helpful to sort of bring people along.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Tracy's point. A lot of people use the DC board as an example, and basically, if you look at the Hatch bill that was introduced in December, it was largely based on the legislation that was used for the District of Columbia. And obviously, the relationship is very different. But I just want to point out, though, that the federal government did assume all of the city's pensions. So it was not only an oversight board that was imposed on DC. The federal government actually took over a significant amount of liabilities on their books. So Mr. Williams conveniently forgets to mention that little part when he testifies before Congress or goes before the press. In the case of Puerto Rico, the things that have been put on the table are things like Medicaid parity. Medicaid is important for many reasons, but in economic terms, it's if you take away interest expenditures, spending on the government health plan is by far the largest driver of the Puerto Rico deficit. And a significant part of that deficit is due to the fact that the Puerto Rico government has to assume a lot of spending to cover low-income residents of the island that would otherwise be covered by Medicaid. So that's very important. We understand, though, that given the political situation in Washington, it's going to be very hard and controversial to get anything along those lines. But when I mentioned in my remarks that we needed some short-term fiscal and stabilization measures, those are the kind of things that I was talking about, because we need to stabilize the fiscal situation and the economic situation so we can set up a platform upon which to build economic growth going into the future. But if you don't do that first step, you're not going to be able to do the second. So.